In a quiet village in Devon, an unexpected guest walked down the aisle at Amelia and James's wedding, and what happened next changed everything. The kind-hearted bride was about to face something far more complicated than she'd ever imagined, a choice that would test her very soul. In the light of flickering candles, this one moment held a story of pain, betrayal, and an unlikely love that could heal the deepest wounds. If you want to know what happened next, don't forget to subscribe and stay for the whole story. The church, built from ancient stone and filled with the delicate fragrance of spring flowers, was wrapped in an expectant hush. Amelia stood at the altar, her veil trailing softly behind her, her gaze locked with James's. She felt a deep calm settle over her, a sense that all her heartbreaks and lonely nights had finally led her to this moment, here with him. James smiled, reaching out for her hands, and as the vicar began to speak, Amelia thought that she might finally be at peace. She squeezed James's hand, her heart fluttering with joy. But then, amidst the sacred silence, a sound of uneven, hesitant footsteps echoed down the aisle. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire, as all eyes settled on a small figure at the back of the church. A young girl, no older than 7, was making her way down the aisle, her head lowered, clutching something tightly. In her little hands was an old, cracked plastic bucket, as if it held something fragile and precious. Dressed in a tattered grey coat, her hair tangled and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, she moved slowly, as though every step was a struggle. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts told her something was wrong. As the girl drew nearer, Amelia could see the tremble in her small hands, the paleness of her skin. She felt an overwhelming urge to run to the girl, to lift whatever weight she was carrying. And then the girl stopped, standing directly in front of Amelia, her wide, pleading eyes looking up at her. "Help me," she whispered, her voice so quiet, so full of desperation, it felt like a cry for help straight from her soul. Amelia dropped James's hand, kneeling down in front of the child. Her own heart was pounding, the entire church forgotten. She glanced at the bucket, and her breath caught in her throat. Wrapped in a worn-out, faded blanket lay a tiny baby, barely stirring, its little face barely visible. "What's your name, love?" Amelia asked softly, her voice gentle, her heart aching with a strange familiarity. She felt as if she'd seen those eyes before, the same lost expression she'd worn when she was that age, abandoned and afraid. "Ellie," the girl whispered, her eyes glazing over as though she was about to collapse. Amelia caught her just in time as Ellie's frail form gave way. The congregation gasped, and before Amelia knew it, several people were rushing over. An elderly woman in the crowd, a retired nurse, began to assess Ellie's condition, while Amelia held the baby close, feeling the faintest heartbeat against her palm. James leaned down beside her, his expression hardened, his hand tugging at her arm. "Amelia, what are you doing? We have a wedding to finish." Amelia looked up at him, the words catching in her throat. How could she turn away from these children? "James," she whispered, "I can't just walk away from this. You don't even know them." James's voice was harsh, laced with frustration. "They're not our responsibility." In that moment, something inside Amelia broke. She could see her young self in Ellie, a small child left to fend for herself, forgotten, unwanted. Memories flooded back, nights spent wondering why she hadn't been good enough to keep her own mother by her side. Her mother had walked away without a backward glance, leaving a little girl to grow up without answers, without warmth. She wouldn't let that happen to Ellie. Without another thought, she held Ellie's frail body close, feeling her heartbeat beneath her trembling fingers. "They are now," she whispered, her voice fierce and unwavering. James took a step back, his face darkening. "Amelia, if you leave this altar, there's no coming back. I won't be waiting for you." The weight of his words crashed over her, the sting of an ultimatum on what was meant to be the happiest day of her life. She looked at James, the man she thought she'd spend forever with, but all she saw was coldness, a stranger who would turn his back on a child in need. Amelia's voice was barely a whisper, but steady. "Then perhaps you were never meant to be in my life, James." She turned away from him, ignoring the shocked murmurs and whispers around her. Her fingers brushed Ellie's damp forehead as she looked down at the child, her heart swelling with fierce protectiveness. She felt like she was letting go of one life and stepping into another, one filled with unknowns and hardship, but one she couldn't walk away from. The nurse, kneeling beside her, shook her head gravely. This little girl, she's malnourished, likely hasn't had a decent meal in days. Her eyes were full of sorrow as she glanced at Amelia. And this baby, it's a miracle they've survived out there, all alone. The word struck Amelia like a dagger. She thought of all the times she'd been hungry, lonely, and lost in her own childhood. The ache she'd buried deep inside her all these years came rushing back, piercing and raw. She knew now she couldn't leave these children, no matter the cost. With the ceremony in shambles, Amelia made the difficult decision. She gathered Ellie in her arms, clutching the baby to her chest as she rose to her feet. She could feel the stares of every guest in the room, the shock, the disapproval. But she didn't care. She would fight the world to protect these children if she had to. James's voice cut through the silence like ice. Amelia, think about what you're doing. You're throwing your life away for strangers. Without looking back, she walked towards the doors, feeling the cool breeze as she stepped outside, her old life slipping away with every step. Her heart was pounding, her mind a blur. The weight of the two children in her arms felt like both a burden and a blessing, a choice she had made that she would never regret. But as she walked away from the church, her thoughts were pierced by a sobering realization: she had no idea where to go next. The wind bit cold against Amelia's skin as she stepped away from the church, cradling the baby and holding Ellie's small, fragile hand. She could feel Ellie's grip tightening, as if afraid Amelia might vanish into the mist that swirled around them. The soft whimpers of the baby in her arms were a reminder of their delicate, vulnerable state. She needed somewhere safe, a place where they could find warmth and a moment's peace to think. As the church faded behind her, Amelia turned toward her family's farmhouse, nestled just beyond the village. Her mother and father, though estranged in recent years, were still family. Surely, she thought, they would understand. They would take her in, offer her support in the way she needed, the way these children needed. The farmhouse came into view, with its slate roof and white stone walls, a place that once held memories of laughter and love, now tinged with the bitterness of years of silence. She approached the door, her heart filled with a sliver of hope as she knocked softly, the weight of the baby and Ellie by her side making her feel both burdened and determined. Her mother, Sylvia, opened the door, her face a mix of surprise and irritation. "Amelia," she began, her eyes flicking from Amelia to Ellie, and then to the baby. What's happened?" "Mother," Amelia said, her voice trembling. "I need help. Please, just let us in." Sylvia's lips pressed into a thin line as she took in the sight of her daughter, once the poised bride-to-be, now standing on her doorstep with two strange, forsaken children. Without a word, Sylvia stepped aside, and Amelia led Ellie and the baby into the warmth of the house. She settled Ellie on a worn-out chair by the fire and rocked the baby gently, relieved to feel warmth seep into their bones. Her mother's gaze was sharp, cold. "So, you've left James, I assume?" "Yes," Amelia replied, her voice soft but steady. "But I had to. These children, they need me." Sylvia's eyes narrowed. "You're throwing your life away, Amelia. For what? These are not your children." She said it as if the words themselves were poison. "Why on earth would you take on such a burden? And at what cost?" The harshness in her mother's tone cut through Amelia, stinging like a slap. "Because I couldn't leave them. I saw myself in that little girl, mother, left, abandoned. I couldn't turn my back." Sylvia scoffed. "So, you're trying to rewrite your own story? Don't be naive, Amelia. You think you can just pick up two children and save them, like it's some fairy tale? And what about your own life? What about us?" Amelia's gaze dropped, the words piercing her resolve. She had hoped, foolishly, that her family would understand, that they would see the pain in her heart, the raw need to protect these children. But as Sylvia's words sank in, she realized just how little sympathy her family held for her choice. Then her father, Edward, entered the room, his face set in a frown. "Amelia," he began, his voice calm but firm, we can't support this. You're taking on a burden far beyond what you can handle. There are proper ways to deal with these kinds of situations. Surely there are orphanages or shelters." Amelia's chest tightened, her pulse quickening. "Orphanages? Father, they need love, stability, not another institution. They need a home." Edward sighed, shaking his head. "And what of your future, Amelia? You've spent your whole life preparing for stability. And now, you throw it away for strangers?" Amelia's heart clenched, but she held her ground, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not strangers anymore, Father. They're mine now." Sylvia turned away, scoffing under her breath, and Amelia knew. She knew they would never see these children as she did. She gathered Ellie and the baby, feeling a deep ache settle in her heart, a pain she thought only those closest to her could have prevented. "Fine," Sylvia said finally, her tone cold and clipped. "But do not expect us to pick up the pieces when this all falls apart. You've made your choice, Amelia. You can live with it." Her father stepped forward, opening the door, his gaze a mixture of pity and resignation. "If you leave with them, Amelia, you're on your own." The words hung in the air, slicing through her like shards of glass. She was being cast out, not just from the safety of her parents' home but from the very fabric of family she'd thought unbreakable. Her hand shook as she held Ellie close, feeling the weight of her choice pressing down on her, heavier than she had anticipated. "I understand," Amelia replied, her voice quiet but steady. She looked back at her parents, at the life she was leaving behind, knowing that this was a final goodbye. With Ellie's hand firmly in hers and the baby cradled close, she walked through the doorway, feeling the sharp sting of rejection like a winter wind on her skin. As the door closed behind them, Amelia looked down at Ellie, who was watching her with wide, frightened eyes. "We're going to be all right, Ellie," she whispered, though her voice wavered. "We'll find someone who cares." But as they moved down the dark, narrow road, the fog thickening around them, Amelia realized she had nowhere to turn. The air was damp as Amelia trudged through the narrow streets, Ellie clutching her hand and the baby bundled against her chest. The rejection from her family still throbbed in her heart like a fresh wound. She glanced down at Ellie, her wide eyes gazing up, searching Amelia's face as if for a glimmer of reassurance. Amelia forced herself to smile, hoping it might hide her own doubt, her fear. As they walked, a familiar face appeared in the hazy glow of the streetlight. It was Robert, an old family friend, older than Amelia by several decades, but someone she'd once trusted. When she was a child, Robert had often been kind, offering small comforts whenever she felt overlooked by her own parents. He was a tall man, with a kindly face softened by age and a voice that carried the warmth of a past era. "Amelia?" he asked, his brows knitting together in surprise and concern as he took in the sight of her with the children. "What on earth are you doing out here in the dead of night? And who are these little ones?" She faltered, unsure of how much to say. But her exhaustion and desperation weighed heavy, so she told him the basics of how Ellie and the baby had found her, how she couldn't bear to leave them, how her family had turned her away. Robert listened intently, nodding at intervals, his face a mixture of sympathy and worry. "Amelia," he said slowly, a gentleness in his tone that felt like the first kindness she'd felt all day, "I have a guest cottage on my property. It's small, but it's warm and dry, and you're welcome to stay there with the children until you find your feet." Tears pricked at Amelia's eyes. Relief flooded her. For the first time since stepping out of the church, she felt a glimmer of hope. She whispered her thanks, her voice breaking, and followed Robert down the winding road to his cottage on the edge of the village. The cottage was modest but cozy, with a small fireplace and a snug kitchen. Robert showed them around, making sure the fire was lit, and brought them blankets and a fresh loaf of bread. Ellie's face lit up at the sight of the warm flames and food, her cheeks flushed from the cold as she nibbled a piece of bread, a small smile peeking out as she sat by the fire. "Thank you, Robert," Amelia said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." "Nonsense," he replied, waving her gratitude away with a kind smile. "I've known you since you were a girl, Amelia. I know your heart. You're doing the right thing. As the days passed, Amelia settled into a fragile sense of security. The cottage became a haven, a place where she could rebuild her strength. Each morning, she rose before dawn, helping Ellie with her hair and clothes, and caring for the baby, who had grown more responsive, his eyes wide with curiosity. Robert visited every day, bringing fresh groceries and, occasionally, small toys for Ellie, his presence steady and warm. One rainy afternoon, as the children napped, Robert sat across from Amelia, nursing a cup of tea. He looked at her thoughtfully, his fingers tapping the side of his mug. "Amelia, I've been thinking," he began, his voice gentle but with an edge of seriousness. "It can't be easy caring for 2 children alone, with no job, no family backing you. You need stability, a way to make a future for yourself and these little ones." Amelia nodded, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I know," she replied. "I've been thinking of looking for work, but I don't know where to begin. And the baby needs constant care." A small smile crept onto Robert's face. "I may have an idea," he said, leaning forward. "There's a friend of mine in town who owns a small bakery. He's always saying he could use an extra pair of hands. I could speak to him for you, see if he'd be willing to hire you part-time. Ellie could come along, and I could watch the baby here." Amelia's eyes filled with hope. The thought of earning her own way, of giving the children even a sliver of stability, felt like a lifeline. "Oh, Robert," she murmured, her voice thick with gratitude. "That would mean everything to me." The following day, Robert took her to meet his friend, Mr. Henshaw, an elderly man with a thick beard and a gruff manner, but a warmth in his eyes that set her at ease. He agreed to hire her, and within days, Amelia found herself baking loaves of bread and icing cakes, her hands learning the rhythm of honest work. She would often catch herself smiling as she worked, feeling, for the first time in a long time, a faint sense of purpose. But as the days turned into weeks, small things began to prick at her peace. Robert's visits grew more frequent, and his conversations often veered toward her gratitude. He would hint that she owed him for his kindness, his tone gentle but with an undertone that made her uneasy. One evening, as Amelia prepared dinner, Robert arrived at the cottage with a bottle of wine. He poured 2 glasses and raised his toward her. "To a new beginning, Amelia," he toasted, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her shift uncomfortably. She raised her glass half-heartedly, sipping only a little. "Thank you, Robert," she replied, keeping her tone polite. He set down his glass and reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You know, Amelia, I've done a lot for you these past weeks. You and the children, well, I'd hoped we could become closer." The words chilled her. She pulled her hand away, trying to keep her voice steady. "Robert, I'm very grateful for everything you've done. But I can't offer you anything more than friendship." His face darkened, the kind expression vanishing in an instant. "Friendship," he repeated, his tone bitter. "Amelia, I've given you a roof, food, a job. I thought you understood." Her heart raced, a sick feeling washing over her. She had trusted him, let her guard down, and now she saw the true nature of his kindness. Every gesture, every word, it had all been meant to trap her. "Robert," she said, her voice shaking, "you've been kind, but I owe you nothing beyond my thanks. If you cannot accept that, then I think it's best if we go our separate ways." He stood up, his face twisting with resentment. "Fine, Amelia. But don't expect any more handouts. You're on your own now." Without another word, he stormed out, leaving her alone in the cold silence of the cottage. Amelia sat, stunned, the sickening weight of betrayal settling over her. She glanced at Ellie and the baby, their peaceful faces unaware of the storm that had just ripped through her fragile security. Her mind raced with panic. Robert had provided their food, their shelter, and now, with him gone, she had nothing. That night, as the children slept, she packed a small bag, knowing she couldn't stay in the cottage much longer. She would have to leave soon, but with nowhere to go and no money, the future stretched before her like a dark, empty void. As the early morning light crept through the cottage window, Amelia stared out, feeling her heart sink. She had lost the one safe place they'd found. And this time, she knew there would be no one waiting to catch her. The morning light filtered through the tiny, foggy windows of the cottage, casting pale shadows across the walls. Amelia stood motionless, clutching the baby tightly, as her mind raced. She had only a small bag of clothes and a few leftover groceries, hardly enough to last a week. The cottage had felt like her lifeline, the one place she'd started to feel safe. But with Robert's cold departure the night before, that illusion of safety had shattered. Ellie shuffled into the room, rubbing her tired eyes, her hair a messy tangle around her face. She looked up at Amelia, her voice soft and uncertain. "Where's Mr. Robert?" Amelia forced a small, reassuring smile. "He had to leave, darling. It's just us now." She placed a gentle hand on Ellie's shoulder, though her own heart was heavy with uncertainty. "We're going to go on an adventure today. We'll find somewhere else to stay, all right?" Ellie nodded, trusting, her wide eyes blinking up at Amelia as if seeking answers to questions she couldn't voice. Amelia felt her heart squeeze. She wanted to give Ellie so much more: stability, warmth, even the small luxuries she'd once taken for granted. But for now, all she could offer was her presence. By mid-morning, Amelia had packed their few belongings, bundling the baby in the warmest blanket she could find. She scooped up the small bundle, took Ellie's hand, and they stepped out of the cottage, leaving behind the modest shelter that had briefly felt like home. The damp, crisp air hit her face, and as she walked down the winding road leading back into town, she could feel the weight of uncertainty bearing down on her. Her resolve, once so strong, felt fragile against the mounting reality of her situation. As they entered the edge of the village, the bustling sounds of people going about their daily routine surrounded them. Amelia clutched the baby close and kept a tight hold on Ellie's hand, hoping that somewhere in this village there might be someone willing to help. The day wore on as she went from door to door, stopping at a bakery, a small inn, even a tiny bookshop, explaining her plight in soft, pleading tones. But everywhere, she was met with hesitance or outright refusal, the shopkeepers looking away, muttering apologies, or simply shaking their heads. "We don't have room, miss," the innkeeper said, his gaze dropping uncomfortably as Amelia tried to explain their need. "I wish I could help, but we're just about full up." Disheartened, Amelia nodded and stepped back into the chill of the cobblestone street. She glanced at Ellie, who looked up with a mixture of hope and worry. Amelia could see the girl's silent questions and feel the pressure to reassure her. "It's all right, Ellie," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll find somewhere." But as the sun dipped lower, her own words felt hollow. Finally, she approached a small church at the far end of the village, its steeple rising sharply against the evening sky. The stone walls looked worn but strong, as though they had weathered countless storms over the years. Amelia paused, feeling a flicker of hope. She had heard once that churches sometimes offered sanctuary to those in need. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and led Ellie up the steps. Inside, the church was dimly lit by candlelight, casting long shadows across the wooden pews. An elderly vicar, dressed in a simple black robe, stood near the altar, his back turned as he arranged hymn books on a shelf. Hearing their footsteps, he turned, his eyes crinkling with age but warm with kindness. "Good evening," he greeted, his voice soft and gentle. "Can I help you?" Amelia hesitated, feeling the weight of her desperation, but she forced herself to speak. "I'm sorry to intrude, sir. My name is Amelia. These children, they need shelter. I'm doing my best to care for them, but we have nowhere to go." Her voice broke slightly, and she bit her lip, struggling to hold herself together. "I was hoping, perhaps, you might have a place we could stay. Just for a night or two." The vicar's kind gaze rested on the children, and Amelia could see the sympathy in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "I understand," he replied, his voice gentle. "The church has a small room in the back. It isn't much, just a bed and a wash basin, but you're welcome to stay there for as long as you need." Relief flooded over her, and she whispered her gratitude, her voice trembling. "Thank you, truly." He led them to the small room, barely large enough for the bed it held. But to Amelia, it felt like a refuge. That night, she watched as Ellie drifted into a peaceful sleep on the bed, her little face relaxed for the first time in days. Amelia sat on the floor with the baby cradled in her arms, feeling exhaustion settle over her like a heavy blanket. In the morning, the vicar brought them bread and cheese, and after a humble breakfast, Amelia thanked him, determined not to overstay their welcome. But as she prepared to leave, he stopped her with a kind hand on her shoulder. "Miss Amelia," he said quietly, "there is no rush. You and the children are welcome here until you're ready to move on." Gratitude filled her heart, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the comfort of his words. Over the following days, Amelia helped around the church, cleaning the small room and assisting with tasks where she could. Ellie enjoyed playing quietly in the pews, her laughter echoing faintly in the vast, empty space. But a few days later, as Amelia dusted the pews, the vicar approached her, his face troubled. He held a letter in his hand, and his gaze was filled with regret. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news, Miss Amelia," he said, his tone weighed down with sadness. "The bishop will be visiting next week. I've just received word that he'll be inspecting the church grounds." Amelia felt her heart sink. She knew the implications. She was, after all, an outsider, a guest in a place that was meant to offer spiritual sanctuary, not a permanent residence. "Please don't worry," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be gone before then." The vicar's face softened with sorrow. "If it were up to me, I would let you stay as long as you need. But my hands are tied." Amelia managed a nod, though a heavy dread settled over her. She gathered Ellie and the baby later that afternoon and explained as gently as she could. Ellie's eyes filled with tears, her small hands clutching Amelia's tightly. "Where will we go, Amelia?" Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. Amelia forced a smile, brushing a tear from Ellie's cheek. "We'll find somewhere else, love. I promise. We'll find a place that's just ours." But as they packed their few belongings once more and stepped out of the church, Amelia's heart pounded with fear. She had hoped this might have been their chance, their one place of refuge. Now, as she stood in the cold once more, she felt as if the walls were closing in, her options dwindling faster than she could grasp them. As they walked back toward the village, she felt the weight of failure pressing down on her, heavier with each step. Amelia walked through the village with Ellie's hand in hers, the baby bundled close to her chest. The sky was a bleak grey, mirroring her own uncertain heart. She moved from door to door, trying once again to find help. But as rejection after rejection mounted, the familiar feeling of despair clawed its way back. She was beginning to question her choice to keep the children, wondering if perhaps she'd been foolish to believe she could offer them anything more than her own stubborn determination. But then, as if fate had heard her silent plea, a woman called out to her from across the street. She was elegantly dressed, with a polished manner and a sympathetic smile that set her apart from the rest of the townspeople. She approached Amelia with a grace that seemed practiced, her eyes settling on Ellie and the baby with a look of calculated pity. "Good afternoon," she said warmly, extending a gloved hand. "My name is Margaret Braxton. I couldn't help but notice you're in a bit of trouble." Amelia felt a surge of relief. Margaret looked like someone with means, someone who could offer them the stability they so desperately needed. "Yes," Amelia replied cautiously, feeling hope stirring once more. "I'm trying to find a safe place for these children. They don't have anyone else but me." Margaret's eyes softened, though Amelia noticed the flicker of curiosity behind them. "I run a small estate just outside of town," Margaret said. "It isn't grand, but it's comfortable. I could use an extra hand with the chores, and you and the children would be well cared for in exchange." Amelia's heart leapt. "You mean you'd allow us to stay with you?" "Of course," Margaret replied smoothly, placing a reassuring hand on Amelia's arm. "I can see you're doing the best you can. It would be my pleasure to give you all a place to call home, even if just for a while." Tears pricked Amelia's eyes. The possibility of a warm bed, steady meals, and a roof over their heads was almost too much to hope for. She nodded, whispering her thanks, and Margaret led them through town toward her estate, talking softly as they walked. She explained that she had no family, only a sprawling old house in need of some upkeep, and she assured Amelia that the children would be welcome, as long as Amelia contributed her fair share. When they reached the estate, Amelia's breath caught. Margaret hadn't exaggerated, though worn. The house was vast and grand, with tall windows and ivy crawling up its stone walls. She felt like she'd stepped into another world, a place far removed from the village's damp streets and stares of indifference. Inside, Margaret showed them to a small room, simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a cradle for the baby. Ellie's face lit up, and Amelia couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. Finally, they could rest without worry. The next day, Margaret put Amelia straight to work. She scrubbed floors, washed linens, and polished furniture, working long hours while Margaret oversaw her every move with a sharp eye. Though the work was demanding, Amelia felt an odd sense of peace. She was doing something that mattered, something that was allowing Ellie and the baby to finally feel safe. As the weeks passed, however, Amelia began to notice Margaret's mood shifting. She'd gone from friendly to irritable, her tone biting, her instructions more exacting. The comfort of her offer began to wear thin, and Amelia felt the familiar pang of worry gnawing at her again. She hoped it was just her own insecurities and exhaustion playing tricks on her. But one evening, as she was putting Ellie to bed, Margaret knocked on the door. She stepped inside, her eyes narrowed, lips pursed as she looked around the room with a critical air. "Amelia," she began, her voice sharp, "I have done a great deal for you and these children. Perhaps it's time you began to show some gratitude." Amelia looked up, confused and wary. I am grateful, Margaret. Truly. I've worked as hard as I can to repay your kindness." Margaret's eyes hardened. "Yes, you have. But gratitude is more than just hard work. I've been generous with you, Amelia, and I expect something in return. If you're going to stay here, you'll need to earn it in a way that shows your respect for my generosity." The words felt cold and calculated, twisting something deep inside Amelia. She'd heard this tone before, a demand masked as kindness, and she recognized it for what it was. She knew Margaret's generosity came at a cost, one that would eventually strip her of her dignity. What do you mean?" Amelia asked, struggling to keep the tremor from her voice. Margaret crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "I mean that you need to show me loyalty, Amelia. I've made sacrifices to keep you here, and I won't do it for someone who doesn't know their place." Amelia's heart pounded as she realized the trap she'd fallen into. Margaret's charity was not genuine, it was merely another way to control her, to keep her bound in servitude. The freedom and security she thought she'd found were illusions, strings to be pulled at Margaret's whim. In that moment, she knew she couldn't stay, that this too was just another false hope. But she had nowhere else to go. If she left, they would be out on the streets again. The cold reality of her situation settled heavily over her, each option more unbearable than the last. That night, as the household slept, Amelia lay wide awake, her mind racing. She couldn't keep Ellie and the baby in a place where their safety depended on her submission, her silence. Her eyes drifted to Ellie, curled up in the bed beside her, and she felt a surge of resolve. She wouldn't let them grow up in a place where they would feel unwanted, indebted, bound by the whims of others. She had to find another way. In the early hours of the morning, she gathered their few belongings and slipped quietly out of the room, Ellie's hand clutched tightly in hers. She held the baby close, their small breaths warm against her cheek as they moved through the silent house, her heart pounding with each step. When they reached the front door, she glanced back at the dark hallways and the grand, empty rooms, feeling the sting of one more lost hope. As they stepped out into the cool morning air, Amelia felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, heavier than ever. She didn't know where they would go or how they would survive, but she knew that staying would only bring them more pain. She was tired, battered by rejection and deceit, but she refused to let her spirit break. For Ellie, for the baby, she would find a way. They walked in silence, the dawn breaking slowly over the horizon, casting a pale light on the path ahead. Amelia looked down at Ellie, her heart aching as she wondered how much more the child could endure. They were running out of options, and with each step, the future seemed darker and more uncertain. As they moved through the still sleeping village, Amelia felt a faint stir of dread. There was only one person left who might take them in, one person who had always been a distant shadow in her life. But the memory of past wounds, long-buried pain, filled her with a hesitation that made her pause on the cobblestone street, uncertain if she could truly bear facing him. Yet as she looked down at the children, her own fears seemed insignificant. She had no choice. She would go to him. And this time, she would be ready for whatever he had to say. The dawn was just beginning to cast a grey light over the village as Amelia took each careful step, her heart tightening with every stride toward the edge of town. Ellie's small hand felt cold in her own, and the baby nestled close against her chest, their breaths keeping her going as the memories she'd tried so hard to bury surfaced again. The person she was about to face had once been the only constant in her world, someone she had believed in, had trusted. His name was Thomas, her brother, and when they were young, he had promised to always be there for her. They'd been close, inseparable, sharing secrets and laughter in the long, dark winters when the rest of the world felt distant and cold. But when Amelia's life had spiraled downward, Thomas had quietly stepped back, his loyalty shattered when she'd needed him most. They hadn't spoken since, the silence between them thick with unspoken pain and resentment. Amelia stopped outside his small cottage on the outskirts of town, gathering her courage. The house was dark, the garden wild and unkempt. She could still remember the days they'd spent in that very garden, as children, daring each other to leap over hedges, whispering dreams of the future. But that future had slipped away, leaving only a broken bond and an aching emptiness. She knocked softly, the sound hollow in the still morning air. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his face shadowed and weary. Thomas's eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps guilt, passed across his face. "Amelia?" he asked, his voice rough and low, as if her name had been lost on his tongue for years. His gaze drifted down to Ellie and the baby, his brow furrowing. It's been a long time," Amelia said softly, her voice unsteady. She tightened her grip on Ellie's hand, fighting back the rush of emotions that threatened to spill over. "I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice." Thomas looked at her for a long, searching moment, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he finally said, stepping back and motioning her inside. The cottage was small and cluttered, filled with worn furniture and the scent of old wood. Thomas led them to the modest sitting room, where Ellie and the baby sat quietly beside Amelia. She watched him carefully, uncertain, her heart pounding as she struggled to hold her composure. "Why now?" he asked, his voice quiet but cold. "After all these years, why come to me?" Amelia's throat tightened. She took a steadying breath, unable to meet his gaze. "Because I have nowhere else to go, Thomas. The children, they have no one else but me. I'm all they have." Thomas's eyes softened briefly as he looked at Ellie, but his expression quickly hardened again. "So you thought you'd just show up on my doorstep, expecting me to open my doors, after everything?" She felt the sting of his words, each one landing like a blow. "I didn't come here to dredge up the past, Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I came here because I need help. I thought, maybe, that you could find it in yourself to understand." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Amelia, you left this family behind years ago. You wanted to make your own life, on your own terms, and I respected that. But when you needed us, you shut us out." Her eyes filled with tears, but she fought them back. "I was hurt, Thomas. I was lost, and I didn't know how to let anyone in. And now, I'm trying to do right by these children. They don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes." There was a long silence as he looked at her, his expression wavering between frustration and something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "Fine," he said finally, his tone resigned. "You can stay. But let's not pretend this is a fresh start. We have history, and it's not easily forgotten." Relief washed over her, though his words still cut deep. She gave him a small nod, grateful despite the bitterness lacing his offer. "Thank you, Thomas. Truly." Days passed, and Amelia settled into her brother's cottage, careful to keep her presence light and unobtrusive. She cleaned, cooked, and did whatever she could to repay his reluctant kindness, and though they exchanged few words, the space between them softened ever so slightly as they shared small routines. She tried not to let the tension affect Ellie, who seemed to sense the strain, her usual cheerful spirit subdued in the quiet house. But as the days stretched on, Amelia began to sense something amiss in Thomas's silence. She would catch him watching her, his expression unreadable, his gaze weighted with something she couldn't quite name. And each time he would look away, a flash of guilt in his eyes that only deepened her suspicions. One evening, as she was tucking Ellie into bed, Thomas stood in the doorway, his face pale. "Amelia," he said, his voice strained, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." She froze, her hand resting gently on Ellie's back. She had always feared that there were secrets between them, unspoken truths that lingered in the shadows of their past. But the haunted look in Thomas's eyes told her that whatever he was about to reveal was far more devastating than anything she could have imagined. "Thomas, what is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a step forward, his expression torn. It's about why our family fell apart. Why things turned out the way they did." Her heart pounded, memories flashing through her mind like a storm, the fights, the silences, the unanswered questions. "Go on," she urged, her voice trembling. Thomas looked away, his shoulders sagging as he took a deep breath. "Amelia, our mother, she left us not because she didn't love us. She left because of me. I made a mistake, one I've regretted every day since." Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of his words. "What are you saying?" "I said things to her, horrible things, things I can never take back. I was angry, resentful, and I blamed her for everything. I pushed her away, and she left. She left because of me, and I didn't have the courage to tell you." His voice broke, and he sank into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. "I watched you suffer, watched you fall apart, and I let you believe she abandoned you. I let you carry that pain alone, Amelia." The revelation struck her like a blow, the weight of his confession settling over her like a suffocating fog. She felt her legs give way as she sank onto the edge of Ellie's bed, her mind struggling to process the truth. All those years, she had believed her mother had walked away, had chosen to leave her behind. But now, she saw the truth, her mother's absence had been shaped by her brother's actions, by the bitter resentments and harsh words that had driven a wedge between them all. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Thomas, seeing in him the same brokenness she had carried in her heart for so long. The anger, the grief, the betrayal, it all welled up inside her, crashing over her like a tidal wave. "You let me believe she abandoned us," she whispered, her voice thick with pain. "You let me carry that weight, all these years, while you kept the truth hidden." Thomas raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his face twisted with regret. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know how to tell you, didn't know how to face what I'd done." Amelia looked away, her heart breaking anew as she realized the depth of the pain that had been hidden, the years of hurt that could never be undone. She felt hollow, her trust shattered once again, left with nothing but the knowledge that the people closest to her had failed her in the worst possible way. That night, as she lay awake, the weight of Thomas's confession pressed down on her, and she felt herself drifting further into a darkness she hadn't felt in years. She had come to him seeking shelter, seeking family. Instead, she had been met with a truth that left her more alone than ever. And as dawn approached, she realized that there was no one left to turn to. She had been stripped of the last hope she'd held onto, left with only her fractured heart and the faint, flickering promise she'd made to Ellie and the baby. She would continue on, for their sake, even if the world had abandoned her entirely. The morning sun crept in through the small window, casting a faint glow on the old wooden floor. Amelia lay in bed, exhausted from a sleepless night, her mind still reeling from Thomas's confession. She had carried the weight of her mother's absence her entire life, allowing it to shape her every choice, to deepen every wound. And now, she was left to grapple with the knowledge that the truth had been kept from her, that her brother had allowed her to carry that burden alone. But as the sun stretched further into the room, Amelia knew that dwelling on the past would do little to protect Ellie and the baby. She had to move forward, to find a way to build a new life, even if it meant doing it alone. There was no longer any question of staying under Thomas's roof. She couldn't stomach it, couldn't bear to look into his eyes and see the shadow of everything he'd hidden. The children were still asleep as she quietly gathered their few belongings, her movement slow and silent, so as not to disturb them. She paused by Ellie's bed, gazing at her small, innocent face, her little fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. Ellie's trust in her, her unwavering faith despite everything they'd faced together, gave Amelia the strength to move forward. She gently shook the girl awake, whispering, "Come on, Ellie. It's time for us to go." Ellie blinked up at her, eyes filled with sleepy confusion. "Where are we going, Amelia?" "We're going to find a place that's just ours," Amelia replied, her voice soft but steady. She reached down to pick up the baby, who stirred slightly, his face nuzzling into her shoulder as she held him close. She led Ellie out of the room, their footsteps light on the creaking floorboards as they left Thomas's cottage behind, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The road ahead was lined with frost, the winter chill seeping through her worn coat, but she held Ellie's hand tightly, determined to keep moving. She headed back into the village, her heart sinking as she realized she had no plan, no destination. Every option felt like a door slammed shut, leaving her with nowhere to turn. She had given up her family, her old life, and her dreams, only to find herself alone once more. As they wandered, aimlessly searching for shelter, they eventually came upon a small marketplace on the edge of town. The shopkeepers were setting up their stalls, unpacking fruits, vegetables, and handmade goods. Amelia's stomach churned, reminding her of how little they had eaten in the past few days. She tried to ignore it, but Ellie tugged at her hand, her voice small and hesitant. "Amelia? I'm hungry." Amelia knelt down, brushing a strand of hair away from Ellie's face. "I know, love. I'll find us something soon, I promise." She forced herself to sound confident, though fear clawed at her insides. She had no money left, no connections, and no one willing to help them. As they wandered through the market, a familiar voice called out to her. She turned, seeing Mr. Henshaw, the elderly baker who had hired her for a brief time before her life had spiraled once more. His kindly face softened as he took in the sight of her and the children, and he motioned for her to come over. "Amelia," he greeted warmly, though his eyes held a sadness that told her he understood their plight. "I hadn't expected to see you back here so soon. Are you well?" Her voice wavered as she replied, "We're managing. I'm just trying to find somewhere for us, somewhere safe." Mr. Henshaw glanced at Ellie and the baby, a deep sympathy flickering in his eyes. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small loaf of bread. "Here," he said gently, pressing it into her hands. "Take this. It isn't much, but it'll keep you going for a little while." Amelia felt a surge of gratitude, tears stinging her eyes as she thanked him. She broke off a piece for Ellie, handing it to her and watching the child's face light up as she tasted the fresh bread. For a moment, Amelia allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, a belief that kindness could still exist in the world, however fleeting. But as she and the children made their way further down the street, that hope quickly faded. With no money and no shelter, she was running out of options faster than she could grasp them. As the afternoon turned to evening, the cold grew sharper, biting at her skin. The weight of isolation pressed down on her, a relentless reminder that she had chosen this path, and now, she had to see it through, even if it meant doing so alone. By nightfall, Amelia found a small alley tucked away behind a row of shops. It wasn't much, just a narrow stretch of cobblestones bordered by empty crates and a few discarded boxes, but it would provide them some shelter from the wind. She settled down, wrapping the baby in her coat, pressing him close to keep him warm. Ellie snuggled up beside her, her eyes wide with worry as she looked up at Amelia. "Are we going to stay here tonight?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible in the dark. Amelia forced a smile, brushing a gentle hand over Ellie's hair. "Just for tonight, love. Tomorrow, we'll find somewhere better. I promise." But as she held the children close, huddled against the cold stone wall, Amelia knew that tomorrow held no guarantees. She was trapped, every path leading back to the same place, the streets, the cold, and the unending uncertainty that loomed over them like a shadow. In the early hours of the morning, Amelia stirred as the first light began to filter through the alleyway. Her body ached, her muscles stiff from the unforgiving ground. She was exhausted, worn thin by the relentless struggle to survive, to keep going for the sake of the children. But as she slowly rose, preparing to move once more, a shadow appeared at the mouth of the alley. She squinted, her heart racing as the figure stepped forward, their face still obscured by the dim light. For a moment, fear gripped her, her mind racing with possibilities, but as the figure came closer, she saw a familiar face, one she hadn't expected to see again. It was Mrs. Finch, a woman she'd once known in passing, a quiet but watchful presence in the village who rarely spoke but always seemed to notice the small details others overlooked. Mrs. Finch's gaze softened as she looked at Amelia and the children, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding that made Amelia's heart ache with relief. "Amelia," Mrs. Finch said softly, her voice laced with concern. "What are you doing out here?" Amelia hesitated, shame and pride battling within her. We have nowhere to go," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I could manage on my own, but—" Mrs. Finch took a step forward, her expression resolute. "Come with me," she said gently. "I don't have much, but I won't let you and these children stay out here another night." Amelia felt tears fill her eyes, her voice thick with gratitude as she whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. I don't know how to repay you." The older woman shook her head, offering Amelia a small, kind smile. "No need for that, love. Sometimes we all need a helping hand." As they walked through the early morning light, following Mrs. Finch toward a modest, weathered home at the edge of the village, Amelia felt the weight of isolation begin to lift, just slightly. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the trials they'd faced had left scars that would take time to heal. But for now, there was warmth, shelter, and perhaps most importantly, the kindness of a stranger who had given them a small flicker of hope. And as she entered the cottage, feeling the warmth of the fire and the gentle hum of a safe, quiet space, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Mrs. Finch's small cottage was simple and unassuming, with worn wooden floors and a warm, crackling fireplace in the center of the sitting room. The scent of lavender drifted from small bundles tied with twine and hung along the walls, filling the air with a sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, Amelia felt her shoulders relax, the unyielding knot of anxiety loosening just a bit. Mrs. Finch, a quiet woman with a gentle smile, offered Amelia and the children tea and bread, her movement slow but steady, each gesture filled with a quiet kindness. Ellie's face lit up as she sipped the warm tea, and even the baby cooed softly, as if sensing the peace of this new refuge. Amelia felt her heart swell with gratitude, her eyes filling with tears she quickly brushed away. It felt like they had finally found a place where they could breathe. "You and the little ones can stay as long as you need, dear," Mrs. Finch said softly, her eyes kind as she looked over at them. "I live alone, and there's plenty of space. You're not intruding in the least." Amelia clasped her hands in her lap, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. I don't know how to repay you." Mrs. Finch waved her hand dismissively. "There's no need for repayment, Amelia. Kindness is rare in this world, and we must hold on to it when we can." She paused, her gaze drifting to the children with a soft smile. "Besides, these little ones deserve a chance to rest, to grow up safe." In the days that followed, Amelia helped with chores around the cottage. She swept floors, mended clothes, and tidied the kitchen, eager to contribute however she could. Mrs. Finch would tell stories of her younger days, of a husband lost too soon and the son who had gone abroad years ago. Amelia felt a bond form between them, an unspoken connection born from shared struggle and loss. Ellie's laughter filled the cottage as she played by the fire, her cheeks flushed, her spirit lightened by the security they had found here. And the baby, whom Amelia had begun calling Oliver, grew stronger each day, his little fingers curling around Amelia's as he looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. For the first time, Amelia dared to hope that they could build a life here, that perhaps this was the end of the long, winding road that had left them battered and bruised. But as the days turned to weeks, Amelia began to notice small changes in Mrs. Finch. The older woman's once gentle gaze grew more watchful, her questions more probing. She began to inquire about Amelia's past, her family, her decisions, questions that seemed innocent enough at first, but soon began to feel invasive, as though Mrs. Finch were testing her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mrs. Finch leaned forward, her eyes sharp and intent. "Amelia, I've been meaning to ask you, why did you end up here, with no family willing to take you in? It seems odd, don't you think? A young woman with no one willing to help her." Amelia hesitated, the question piercing a vulnerable part of her. She'd spoken little of her family, not wanting to burden Mrs. Finch with the painful details. "It's complicated," she replied slowly. "I didn't come from a supportive family. And when I needed them most, they weren't there." Mrs. Finch tilted her head, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Is that so? Or could it be that you chose to leave them behind? That you made mistakes, ones that cost you everything?" The word stung, a cruel twist that made Amelia's heart pound with unease. "I did what I had to," she murmured, fighting back the wave of defensiveness rising within her. "For the children's sake." Mrs. Finch gave a tight, knowing smile. "Well, we all have our reasons, don't we? And the choices we make, they follow us, Amelia. It's important not to let pride lead us down a path we can't come back from." That night, Amelia lay awake, Mrs. Finch's words echoing in her mind. She had thought the woman's kindness was genuine, that this was finally a place where she and the children could find peace. But now, she wasn't sure. There was something in Mrs. Finch's tone, something in the coldness that had slipped into her voice, that made Amelia's skin prickle with dread. The next morning, Amelia awoke to the sound of voices outside the cottage. She looked out the window and saw Mrs. Finch standing with a tall man she didn't recognize, his back turned to her as they spoke in hushed tones. Mrs. Finch's face was stern, her expression one of irritation and something else, something almost triumphant. Her heart sank as she watched them, a growing sense of foreboding tightening her chest. She couldn't make out their words, but the man nodded as Mrs. Finch gestured toward the cottage, her voice carrying a tone that sounded like dismissal. Amelia pulled back from the window, her mind racing. Something was wrong. Later that day, Mrs. Finch approached her in the sitting room, her gaze cold and calculating. "Amelia," she began, her voice devoid of the warmth it once held. "I've been thinking, and I believe it's time we come to an understanding." Amelia's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Finch's mouth twisted into a thin smile. "I took you in because I believed you were an honest woman, someone who simply needed a bit of help. But I see now that you're more of a burden than I anticipated. The money for food, the strain on the household, it's too much. I've made arrangements for you." A chill ran through Amelia. "Arrangements?" "Yes," Mrs. Finch replied, her tone final. "There's a shelter in the next town. They'll take you and the children in, provide you with what you need. But it's clear to me that you've become a liability here." Amelia's vision blurred as the betrayal struck her like a physical blow. This woman, who had offered her warmth and security, who had given her a glimmer of hope, was now casting her out as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Amelia tried to keep her voice steady. "But you said we could stay. You said we were safe here." Mrs. Finch shrugged, her expression unmoved. "Things change, Amelia. And charity only goes so far. I've already contacted the shelter, they're expecting you by tomorrow. I suggest you start packing." The words hit her like a cold wind, each syllable a reminder that her hope had been misplaced once again. She looked down at Ellie, who sat by the fire, oblivious to the conversation that would uproot them once more. And Oliver, nestled in his cradle, his tiny hand reaching out, innocent and unaware of the turmoil surrounding them. That night, Amelia packed their few belongings, her heart heavy with the weight of yet another betrayal. She had trusted Mrs. Finch, had allowed herself to believe that there was goodness in the world, that they had finally found a place to call home. But as she gathered the children and prepared to leave, she realized that every person she'd trusted had let her down, each promise of refuge dissolving into hollow words. As dawn broke, Amelia took one last look at the cottage, feeling a mixture of anger and grief rise within her. She held Ellie's hand tightly, carrying Oliver close to her chest, and stepped out onto the cold road. They walked away from the cottage in silence, the path stretching before them uncertain and bleak. She was out of options, her hope worn thin, her spirit battered by the betrayals that had marked her journey. Yet, as they moved into the rising sun, Amelia's resolve hardened. She would find a way. She would not let the world break her, not now, not ever. But as they rounded the corner, she heard footsteps behind them, and her heart skipped a beat, a faint flicker of fear sparking in her chest as she turned to see who, or what, was coming after her. Amelia froze, her heart pounding as the footsteps grew louder behind her. She held Ellie close, turning slowly to face whoever had followed them, her mind racing with possibilities. She was met with the sight of a man in a worn, tattered coat, his face lined with age but familiar. It was Thomas, her brother, his eyes weary but intent, as if he had finally found what he'd been searching for. "Amelia," he called out, his voice hoarse, wavering slightly as he approached. There was an urgency in his expression, something in his gaze that she couldn't quite place. "Wait. I need to speak with you." Her body tensed, the betrayal from his last confession still fresh in her mind. But she held her ground, her eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Thomas?" Her voice was cold, laced with the bitterness of too many broken promises. Thomas paused, glancing at Ellie and the baby, a hint of guilt flashing across his face. He seemed to wrestle with his words, his gaze dropping to the ground before he met her eyes once more. "I know I failed you, Amelia," he said quietly. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But there's something you don't know. And I can't keep it from you any longer." Amelia felt a flicker of dread rise within her. She wanted to turn away, to protect herself from any more painful truths, but there was a part of her that needed to hear what he had to say. "Then speak," she replied, her tone cold, guarded. Thomas took a shaky breath. "It's about our mother. After she left, I told you she abandoned us. That she chose to leave." He paused, swallowing hard. "But the truth is, she didn't leave by choice, Amelia. She was forced out." A cold shock ran through her, the weight of his words settling like a stone in her chest. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Who forced her to leave?" "Our father," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He discovered something. A secret she'd kept from us, one that he could never forgive. I didn't understand it fully then, but she wasn't our mother by birth, Amelia. She adopted us, brought us into her life. She loved us, and when he found out, he was furious. He demanded that she leave, that she cut all ties with us. The revelation hit Amelia like a wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her mother, the woman she'd believed had abandoned her, the woman she'd resented for so many years, had not been the cold figure she'd thought. She had been someone who had chosen to care for them, to give them love, despite not being bound by blood. "You knew this," Amelia whispered, her voice breaking. "You knew she was forced to leave, and you let me believe she didn't care. You let me grow up thinking I was unworthy of her love." Thomas's face twisted with regret. "I was young, Amelia. I didn't understand why he did it, but I was angry too. When she left, I thought it was because of us, because we weren't enough. I wanted to make her into the villain so that I wouldn't feel the pain of losing her." He closed his eyes, his face etched with shame. "But as I grew older, I realized the truth. And by then, I didn't know how to tell you." Amelia's mind swirled with memories, the distant look in her mother's eyes, the quiet acts of kindness, the lullabies sung in a voice that had once been her comfort. She had spent years blaming her mother, nursing a wound that had festered into resentment, all while never knowing the sacrifices the woman had made. Her father had torn their family apart, driven by anger and pride, and left her to believe a lie. She felt tears slipping down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she held Ellie close. The weight of everything, her abandonment, her struggles, her isolation, it all crashed over her, leaving her breathless. "You let me suffer, Thomas. You could have told me, you could have spared me so much pain." Thomas reached out, but she pulled away, her body taut with anger and grief. "I'm sorry, Amelia," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was protecting you, but I only made things worse. I can't take it back. But I had to tell you. You deserve to know." Amelia looked away, unable to bear the sight of him. Her heart felt shattered, splintered by a truth that had been hidden from her for so long. She had spent her life feeling unlovable, abandoned, all because of a lie. And now, as she stood in the cold morning light, she realized that she had lost everything she had ever known. "Leave, Thomas," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I don't want to see you again. Not after this." He hesitated, looking as if he wanted to say more, but he nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the silence, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she'd lost. As she stood there, Ellie's small hand tugged at her coat, her wide eyes filled with concern. "Amelia," she whispered, her voice soft and unsure. "Are we going to be okay?" Amelia looked down at her, forcing a smile through her tears. "Yes, Ellie," she said, her voice gentle. "We're going to be okay. I promise." But even as she spoke the words, a hollow emptiness gnawed at her. She had no home, no family, and the bitter truth of her past left her feeling more alone than ever. She had nothing left to cling to, nothing except the two small lives in her care. She took a shaky breath, lifting her chin as she looked out at the road stretching before them. She would keep moving, keep fighting. For Ellie, for Oliver, for the memory of a mother she had never truly known. She would carry on, no matter how broken she felt inside. With Ellie's hand in hers and Oliver cradled close, Amelia walked forward, her heart heavy but resolute. They had no destination, no promise of a better future, but she would find a way. She would not let this be the end of their story. As they disappeared down the road, the morning sun casting their shadows long across the cobblestones, Amelia felt a faint glimmer of hope, buried deep within her grief. Perhaps, one day, she would find peace, not in her past, but in the new life she would forge for herself and the children. The weeks that followed were a blur of struggle and survival. Amelia, Ellie, and baby Oliver traveled through quiet villages, relying on small acts of kindness from strangers, a loaf of bread here, a night's shelter there. Amelia held herself together for the children, though her heart was worn thin, her hope fragile. One cold, damp evening, as Amelia and the children trudged through yet another desolate village, they came upon a small farm nestled at the edge of a misty meadow. The house was weathered but inviting, with a thin plume of smoke curling up from its chimney, promising warmth. Amelia hesitated, exhausted yet reluctant to ask for more help. But as the light faded, she knew they had no choice. She lifted her hand to knock, her fingers numb with cold. Before her knuckles could meet the wood, the door swung open, and a middle-aged woman stood there, her eyes soft with warmth and sympathy. She wore a simple woolen dress and a thick shawl, her face lined with the gentle wrinkles of a life spent in honest work. "Good evening," the woman greeted softly, her gaze moving over the children before settling on Amelia. "You look like you could use a place to rest." Amelia's voice was almost too thick with emotion to speak, but she managed a small nod. If it isn't too much trouble. Just for tonight." The woman smiled, stepping aside and ushering them into the warm glow of the cottage. "My name's Margaret," she said, her tone as welcoming as the fire crackling in the hearth. "I've got plenty of room, and as it turns out, a little extra food as well. You're more than welcome here." Amelia exhaled a shaky breath, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She had been burned by kindness too many times, yet something about Margaret's gentle gaze and quiet, unassuming manner eased her fears. Margaret led them to a cozy sitting room, where she handed each of them a steaming mug of tea and served a hearty stew. Amelia watched as Ellie ate, her cheeks flushing with warmth, her little smile a balm to Amelia's weary heart. Oliver slept peacefully in Amelia's arms, his tiny breath soft against her skin. As they ate, Margaret quietly observed, a thoughtful look in her eyes. After they'd finished, she sat beside Amelia, her voice soft. "I won't pry, love, but you look like a woman who's been through her share of hardships." Amelia hesitated, her instinct to protect herself battling with a need to share, to release the burden she'd been carrying for so long. Margaret's presence felt safe, genuine, so Amelia began to speak, her words coming slowly at first, then pouring out like a long-held breath. She told Margaret everything, her past, her family's betrayal, the loss of her mother, the children she had vowed to protect. Margaret listened intently, her expression one of quiet compassion, a depth of understanding that needed no words. When Amelia finished, Margaret placed a warm, comforting hand over hers, her voice gentle but steady. "You've been through more than anyone should have to bear, Amelia. But there's a strength in you, a love that's carried you through it all. And I believe there's a reason you came here, to this very place." Amelia looked at Margaret, uncertainty mingling with hope. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled, her eyes gleaming with a kind of wisdom that felt timeless. "I was married once, many years ago. My husband and I wanted children, but it wasn't meant to be. I've been alone on this farm ever since he passed. There's more work than I can handle, and the days feel long and empty without a family to fill them." Amelia's heart fluttered, daring to hope for the first time. Are you saying you'd let us stay?" Margaret nodded, her expression tender. "Yes, Amelia. Stay here. Help me with the farm, and I'll give you and the children a home. You won't have to struggle alone any longer. You're family now, if you'll have me." Tears filled Amelia's eyes, her heart swelling with gratitude so profound it ached. She looked down at Ellie, who smiled up at her, and then at Oliver, his peaceful face nestled against her chest. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Amelia felt the weight of her burdens lift, replaced by a warmth and peace that filled every part of her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Margaret. I don't know how to repay you." Margaret shook her head, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "There's nothing to repay, dear. We're here for each other. That's all that matters." The days that followed were filled with quiet, steady routines that brought a sense of stability Amelia hadn't felt in years. She and Margaret worked side by side, tending to the animals, mending fences, planting rows of vegetables that would sustain them through the seasons. Ellie thrived in the open fields, her laughter echoing across the meadow as she ran with the chickens and helped collect eggs. Oliver grew stronger with each passing day, his chubby hands reaching for the world with a newfound wonder. One evening, as the sun set over the rolling hills, Amelia sat beside Margaret on the porch, watching the children play. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, the beauty of it filling her with a deep, quiet joy. Margaret looked at her, her eyes reflecting the golden light of dusk. "You know, Amelia, I believe you found your place here. Not just a home, but in a purpose." Amelia nodded, a contented smile gracing her face. "I think I have," she replied, her voice filled with the certainty of someone who had finally come home. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Amelia felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She looked down at her hands, no longer trembling, steady and sure. She had carried so much grief, so much pain, but now, surrounded by love, she felt those wounds beginning to heal. The past still lingered, the scars still there, but they no longer held her captive. Here, with Margaret, Ellie, and Oliver, she was free to build a life filled with love, a life where they could all grow and flourish. Amelia reached out, taking Margaret's hand, the two of them sitting in the peaceful silence, watching the children, watching the night settle over their new world. For the first time, Amelia knew she was no longer alone. She had found her family, not in the place she'd expected, but in a place that had waited for her all along. And as she looked out at the home she'd found, she felt the tender stirrings of hope and joy, the start of a new story, one she was finally ready to embrace.